Now, if you follow the news closely, now this is the time of the year that many nations in Southeast Asia are getting ready to celebrate the Lunar New Year. Of course, including China as well. There's no surprise that those nations today are growing economically and also from the political standpoint, making much greater noises. And again, it's understandable those countries are celebrating. But we will also need to keep in mind some nations around the world aren't celebrating because they're still undergoing this tremendous political transformation. And also for some countries, and they're still facing the devastation of the wars. And for example, the nation of Ukraine. More than 3 years, we're still looking at the war in Ukraine. Now, at this moment, not only we don't know what the future holds, but also we continue to see the devastation of the people in both in Russia and Ukraine. Now, President Trump officially kicked off his administration more than a week. Now, the question really begs from the international community is, will President Trump able to reach a settlement in the war in Ukraine and also in Gaza? How do you think that President Trump is able to carry out the policy and able to restore the peace and also stability in Ukraine and in Gaza? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Mr. Gideon Rose. Mr. Rose is an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also he's the author of the book, How Wars End. Well, Mr. Rose, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Good to be here.
Well, Mr. Rose, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, Ending War, It's Hard to Do, Can Trump Reach Real Settlements in Ukraine and Gaza? Now, I want to get to the question right away. This is what you wrote in the article, and I quote, that Trump could easily find himself shifting back towards the Biden administration's approach in both theaters because U.S. interests and geopolitical realities don't change with the election returns. Now, one thing that we have to understand, Mr. Rose, during the campaign season, the President Trump promised to American citizens and also to the world that the war in Ukraine must end because it is devastating and also it takes a lot of U.S. government, especially finance, from this financial perspective. Now, from you writing that you said U.S. interests and geopolitical realities don't change with the election returns. What are you trying to say regarding Trump's promise to the world and also regarding the war, the outcome of the war? Your thoughts?
Well, it's a great question, and it gets to the question of the role of the individual in history and the role of politics in history, because nations or countries have interests and they have resources and power, and they pursue their interests with the resources and power at their disposal. But they also have leaders. And those leaders have ideas and individual specific attributes. And the question that will come up in Ukraine and elsewhere now in the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, is how much discontinuity will there be in U.S. policy because of the new individual at the top? Trump is a unique creature with extraordinarily idiosyncratic attitudes and emotions, and the extent to which he will change policy in a way that another president wouldn't change it is unclear. He has said he wants to, but how much he'll actually be able to, we don't really know yet. And basically, as I say in the piece, the United States as a country has some pretty standard interests in Ukraine. It has an interest in protecting Ukraine, which is a sort of relatively free, relatively democratic country that it has sort of not quite allied with, but connected with. It has an interest in protecting Europe. For 80 years, the transatlantic community has been a strong pillar of U.S. foreign policy, and European security has been a major U.S. concern. And so Russian aggression towards Europe in the direction that it's going is something the U.S. needs to be concerned about, whether it'll go beyond Ukraine. And in general, checking Russia and its aggression. Remember, this war started in 2014. in a minor way. But then the most recent phase of it started in 2022 when Putin literally sent a war of aggression into Ukraine to try to capture the country in in an old-fashioned war of conquest. And so for the United States, checking Russia, protecting Ukraine, and protecting Europe are all sort of things that one would imagine almost any US president would be involved in. And so what the Biden administration did, especially once it became clear that Ukraine could survive, nobody expected Ukraine to survive that long. Even the U.S. intelligence agencies and security agencies kind of expected, like everybody else, that the Russians would be able to beat the Ukrainians relatively quickly, and that would have been a different scenario. But when Ukraine was able to fend off the initial attacks and survive, pretty much any U.S. president, possibly accepting Trump with his known Russia sympathies, would have worked to support Ukraine and try to keep it in the game. And that's what the United States and Europe did, which is they supported Ukraine. They didn't want to have a war with Russia, and they didn't want to intervene directly in order to prevent the possibility of such a war and to keep escalation relatively low. But they still wanted to keep Ukraine fighting and in the game. And so they supplied lots of aid, and they were prepared to do so for a relatively long time. They kept saying as long as it takes. And the hope was that once Putin recognized that he couldn't make an easy conquest, there would be some sort of negotiated solution. And one of the things that I wrote in the piece was that in wars, the extent to which the relative power of the belligerents is agreed upon versus disputed is an important factor, because if each side really thinks it can win on the battlefield, it is deeply tempted once the war has begun to keep fighting for a little bit in order to gain the upper hand. But at this point, we've now had a war that has gone on for nearly 3 years, and it's been brutally vicious and costly for all involved. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, perhaps even 1 million casualties between the two belligerents, huge amounts of money. And it has settled into something of a relative stalemate. Russia has been gaining a little bit of ground at high cost, but neither side really is able to move the front line that much in the last year and a half. And that has created a condition in which one could imagine some sort of outcome that would essentially split the difference, accept things where they are now, and call it a draw. But the question of the terms of that are not clear, because Russia might still want to control the rest of Ukraine, not just the area it has conquered. And Ukraine is going to be worried about its future survival. So we're in a situation in which even if Biden had been reelected, if Harris had been elected, you would have thought about possibly negotiating some kind of end to the war, or trying to, because the balance of power on the ground could potentially support a settlement now in a way that wasn't true a year or two ago, when each side thought it could gain more by fighting. So the structural conditions for a possible settlement, or at least negotiations or discussions about a settlement, are now there. But the wild card is Trump, and secondarily Putin. Ukraine at this point is so weak and dependent that although it wants to continue fighting, it is sort of at the mercy of the people backing it. And Europe, which we thought would be the biggest problem, has actually turned out to be fairly steadfast in its support. Maybe not huge amounts, but at least relatively steadfast. But the change in administrations in the U.S. has brought to power Trump, who has no particular love for Ukraine, does have a soft spot for Russia, and has been vocal about trying to end the war. And so the question becomes, will Trump try to end the war? The answer is yes. But the question is, what are the terms on which he'll be able to do so? And that's what we're all sort of wondering, because, with Trump, he says things, but half of the things he says are crazy, and half of the things he says shift the next day, and other things there's a sort of kidding, not kidding aspect to Trump, and no one ever knows. And he actually wants it that way, because he feels that his unpredictability and volatility is a source of strength because it keeps everybody else guessing and puts them on their back feet and doesn't know. But now that he's actually president, he's going to have to come down on some policy. And the question here is, will he pressure Ukraine to accept a sort of compromise deal? But then the other question is, what sort of deal does Putin actually want? If Putin wanted or was willing to accept a relatively straightforward compromise with the territory that it exists now, that it has conquered, and letting the rest of Ukraine go, you could imagine actually some kind of settlement that could be negotiated. It wouldn't be a happy one. Ukraine would still be upset at having lost a fifth of its territory. Russia would still be upset at not having gotten more. The United States and Europe would be upset at all the carnage and all the lack of punishment for Russian war crimes and aggression. But you could imagine a settlement along the lines of contact now that would actually be better than this horrible fighting that has occurred. But the interesting question there is, will Putin actually want that, or will he think that if given the American desire to sort of end things and walk away, and given Trump's lack of interest in Ukraine, maybe now is the time to hold out for an even better settlement? So that's what we're going to see in the next few months. The idea that he could solve it the first day was obviously silly, but fairly soon, he's already talked about, okay, maybe a 100 days or a few months. But the interesting question this spring will be, what are the terms on which Trump will accept an outcome, and what are the terms on which Putin will accept an outcome? Because if those two agree, it'll be very difficult for Ukraine to resist. But if there is big divergence between Trump and Putin, then the war could actually continue, and Trump could find himself back in a more Biden-like policy than he or anybody else expects.
Well, Mr. Rose, when we talk about, again, I like the way you describe Trump, which is kidding or not kidding character. But let's talk about one of the key member under this new administration, which is Marco Rubio, and he was newly appointed as the Secretary of the State. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, as you and I were speaking right now, the news came out a few hours ago that it's possible that Marco Rubio represents Trump administration halted any foreign aid to any other countries at this moment. And also, Marco Rubio took on the social media and posted that under the Trump administration, 3 questions are rather essential. And number 1, does it make Americans safe? Does it make American prosperous? And also, most importantly, does it make Americans stronger? Now, we know that during the campaign, of course, that during the first term of President Trump, that he's been running on this model is Make America Great Again, or put in a simple way, is America First agenda. But again, coming back to the war in Ukraine and also in Gaza, something else in the article you mentioned is what we called military and economic potential. This what we called the coalition package. Excuse me. For Mr. Rose, from your perspective, how do we understand the rhetoric like someone from Marco Rubio? And also, how do we understand this military and economic coalition at this moment? I mean, like you said before, since Putin is a wild card and Trump is a wild card, but what is unwild, or what is not wild, it's a frontline battle. People are actually dying, and both countries are draining drastically. So at this moment, what do we understand from the military and economic standpoint, and why do you think that Trump is still able to roll out the dice, even though we still don't know the outcome? Your thoughts?
Okay, it's a good question. So on Rubio first, Trump is a dominant, strong individual who keeps all elements of power in his own hands. It's not like other administrations. Trump is more, he has authoritarian instincts that are not like those of other Democratic leaders, small d. If he, and he is able to, he has imposed his views on his party. And now that he is back for a second term, knowing what he knows from the first, he has picked people who will do what he says.
Mm.
So I don't think there's any, at this point, alternate power center inside the administration. And Rubio is just a spokesperson and a placeholder. If Trump could clone himself and put little, if he could put his kids in each cabinet department
Mm.
as the heads, he would if he had more kids.
Mm.
But instead, he can't. So he puts in people who are just proxies. But Rubio, whatever his past views, has shown himself to be willing to do whatever Trump wants. And so I don't think there's any reason to take Rubio's independent concerns or statements seriously. It's all about Trump
Mm.
and the structural factors that Trump might be constrained by, but it's not like there's an independent personnel power center. With regard to the rhetoric that he was using and talking about, nobody would dispute that it's about prosperity and strength and greatness, whatever. The question becomes how you define those terms. The real issue here is for the last 80 years, the United States, ever since the end of World War II, the United States has followed a foreign policy based on teamwork. It has the traditional history of great power relations was every party for itself, conflict, and in the economic sphere, competition, in the military sphere, competition, and do what you can and be as strong as you can. The problem was that system produced constant wars every generation or two. And it got to a point where after World War II, the United States, having won that war and having won it with nuclear weapons, said to itself, okay, we just can't afford to keep going in this old pattern. So we're going to establish a new pattern, and we're going to not just simply either dominate the world ourselves, and we're not just simply going to retreat to let it go back to the old ways, but we're going to put together a kind of group of nations and a coalition to kind of run the world through a kind of condominium. And so it established NATO, and it established the UN sort of as a weird kind of thing. And it tried to essentially work with allies that it was relatively friendly with to stabilize and protect a zone of peace and economic cooperation that would serve American interests. The idea was that American interests would be best served by a cooperative, peaceful environment with other countries around it, rather than simply fighting constantly and grabbing a little bit here and there. That it could benefit more if it played well with others than if it was constantly fighting with them. And that basic idea underlay the American sphere in the Cold War, what we called the West, the liberal order. And then after the Soviet Union and the East Bloc collapsed at the end of the 1980s and in the early 1990s, that basic system spread more generally. So an American, NATO, European, Western sort of zone of peace and economic capitalism and whatever spread around the world. And the idea has been for 80 years of the US, absent the first Trump administration, that US interests were best served by coordinating our foreign policies and security policies and economic policies with at least some other nations, our allies, and that we would protect those allies, work together with them, and in that environment would do well. What Trump represents, and has always, Trump never bought into this vision. He's the first president since Roosevelt ever to have fundamentally rejected this vision. He is a nationalist. He does not believe in cooperation in general. He does not believe in economic trade. He has a zero-sum view of the world in which my gain is your loss and your gain is my loss. The entire post-war order that the United States created in 45 and later was based on the notion of positive sum games. It was based on the notion that if we trade, we'll both do better. That's how capitalism works. It's not predatory. It's, yes, there's a surplus that's produced and we can fight over who gets the surplus, but free interactions will grow the pie. That in security terms, the United States could be secure and the West Europeans could be secure. And then eventually the rest of everybody could be secure together. And that our security wasn't at the expense of others, but it was in conjunction with others. Trump fundamentally doesn't believe any of this. He is an old-fashioned nationalist who believes in effect, in Russia after the war, Stalin was talking about socialism in one country. Trump believes in capitalism in one country and security in one country. So the thing that we don't know yet is, what does that mean when a person with those views is put in at the top of a large structure of cooperating nations? In other words, if he had his druthers, he would abandon alliances, he would abandon cooperation, he would just simply go it alone in an old-fashioned 1930s way and tell everybody else, screw you, right? And we've already seen his impulses and his rhetoric to this effect. But that's so completely contrary to everything that has happened in the world in the last 80 years that he can't just do that. And so that's why we're all going around wondering what the hell is going to happen now, because we just don't know, because somehow he's going to do some damage to this system of cooperation, and he's going to fail to cooperate in ways that others would want or expect the American president to cooperate. But he won't be able to do everything that he wants in terms of walking away, taking his marbles, and coming home. And the real question here is, Ukraine right now is dependent on American help to fight off Russia. And so this becomes the first major test case, particularly in the security sphere, for just how isolationist Trump is going to be. I mean, maybe the second case after Greenland or Panama, because he's talked about doing old-fashioned 19th century imperialism as well. So we're all just basically watching this, and nobody, even the supposed experts, doesn't know what's going to happen next, because you have an unstoppable force, the president of the United States, who's very energetic and very determined, meeting an immovable object, the global international order, which is based on a very different set of principles than Trump believes.
Mr. Gideon, I know your time it's almost running out, but I got one more question, and I promise you I'll let you go very soon. Now, the last question I want to ask is regarding the concept of sanctions. And we know that for Russia, US, and many other countries have been actively placing sanctions on Russia, and it doesn't seem like Putin is buying into this idea. And also, you are the author of the new book called How War Ends. Now, the final question I want to ask is, how much do we believe that under Trump administration, or for the year of 2025, that the effectiveness of sanctions are still working, especially for Russia? And also, why do you think that Putin is a daredevil and still trying to challenge the status quo? Your final thoughts, Mr. Rose.
So Putin, like Trump, is fundamentally a bit of a bully. And he is basically betting that he's dealing with weak enemies who can be bullied. And so even though he's lost a lot of blood and treasure and capital, he thinks that his will is stronger and that his enemies are weak and that he can outlast them and impose his will on them. It's a very personal thing. Trump feels sort of the same way, although he's not nearly as strong personally as Putin. So he likes the optics of things. With regard to sanctions, it's not clear. Trump doesn't like sanctions. His version of sanctions that he likes are tariffs. He has some weird, strange fascination with tariffs, which is a particular kind of economic tool and he doesn't really seem to understand much about how economics works. But his idea seems to be that blocking the American market is something that is an all-purpose economic tool to coerce others. It happens to have costs in the U.S. as well. But so what previous American administrations would do vis-a-vis sanctions, Trump will try to do vis-a-vis tariffs. So that I would expect not newer sanctions, but more tariffs from Trump whenever he disagrees with somebody. With regard to the current sanctions on Russia, the question becomes, how do those get lifted? It's always easier to put things on than to take them off. and that will have to come off as part of a settlement. And so that's actually the real incentive for Putin, because although he denies it, he's actually hurting quite significantly. The Russian economy is not doing well. It is able to keep going. He's turned it into a war economy. The Chinese government has enabled it to continue to sort of operate. But after another year or so, by the end, the best people who study this stuff seem to think that by the end of 2025, the Russian economy will really be in bad shape, and that Putin will be under much more pressure from the sanctions. So this, again, creates the possibility of some kind of settlement during this year, because each side has some reason to be hopeful, but some reason to be worried, and is spending a lot of money and effort without getting much gain. So you could imagine a deal during the course of 2025, but it also depends on the will of these individual leaders, particularly Putin and Trump, who are very volatile and whose idea of a deal is I win, you lose, rather than a compromise. But that's, at the end of the day, the only way the sanctions get lifted and the war ends is some kind of mutual agreement. And we're all just sort of wondering what that's going to look like. The best bet might be, at least for the next 6 months, that there is no deal and things just keep going as they have been.
Well, again, Mr. Rose, as you mentioned before, Trump, it's a wild card, and we don't know what will happen within the first 100 days. But meanwhile, at the end of the day, let me just echo what you just said. It's the real settlement in both Ukraine and Gaza are rather crucial, not only for the citizens, but also for the international community. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Mr. Gideon Rose. Mr. Rose is an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also he's the author of this amazing book, How Wars End. Well, Mr. Rose, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. And again, thank you so much for doing this.